The Queen's body had become unrecognizable. In the dim candlelight of her chamber at Hampton Court, Anne of Denmark lay motionless, her breathing shallow and laboured. The February cold of 1619 seeped through the stone walls, but inside the room it was stifling. Braziers burned constantly, filling the air with aromatic smoke that failed to mask the underlying smell of sickness. Her attendants moved quietly, speaking in whispers, their faces drawn with exhaustion and something else. Fear. Something was very wrong with the Queen, and everyone knew it. But what exactly was killing her remained a mystery wrapped in the secretive protocols of royal medicine and the limited understanding of 17th century physicians. Only two people were permitted, close to her. Pierre Hugen, her loyal French servant, and Anna, her Danish chamberer, Dutch Anna, as the English court called her. These two women had become the gatekeepers to the dying Queen's presence, turning away courtiers, relatives, even high-ranking nobles. Anne wanted privacy for what was happening to her body. She wanted dignity, but dignity was becoming impossible. King James remained at Theobald's, miles away, claiming illness of his own. Prince Charles had visited the day before, anxious, pale, clearly shaken by what he'd seen. Outside, London was buzzing with rumours. The Queen was dying. Everyone agreed on that much. But of what? Some whispered it was consumption, the wasting disease that had claimed so many. Others spoke of dropsy, of poison, of God's judgment. A great comet had appeared in the sky in November, its tail stretching across the constellation of Virgo, and the superstitious saw it as a celestial announcement. A queen would soon die. But comets and prophecies aside, what was actually happening inside that sealed chamber at Hampton Court? How does a queen, one of the most powerful women in Europe, with access to the best physicians money could buy, end up dying in such mysterious, degrading circumstances? To understand Anne of Denmark's death, we need to go back, not just weeks or months but years, because what killed Anne in March 1619 had been killing her slowly for a very long time. Before we move ahead, allow me a moment. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories like this. Comment where you're watching from, and prepare yourself, because what follows is where the story begins to press in. First, who was Anne of Denmark? Anne of Denmark was not supposed to be Queen of England. Born in 1574 at Skanderborg Castle in Denmark, she was the daughter of King Frederick II of Denmark and Norway and Sophie of Mecklenburg-Güstrow. As a Danish princess, her destiny was to make a strategic marriage that would benefit her homeland. But no one imagined she would end up ruling over 3 kingdoms. In 1589, at just 15 years old, Anne was married to James VI of Scotland, a match designed to strengthen the Protestant alliance in Northern Europe. The wedding itself became legendary. James, impatient to meet his bride, actually sailed to Norway to fetch her himself when storms prevented her ship from reaching Scotland, a romantic gesture completely out of character for the notoriously unromantic king. Anne arrived in Scotland as a teenage bride, speaking no English, thrust into the rough, factional world of Scottish court politics. But she was no delicate flower. Over the next 14 years in Scotland, Anne proved herself shrewd, stubborn, and politically astute. Then, in 1603, everything changed. Queen Elizabeth I of England died childless, and James VI of Scotland inherited the English throne as James I, uniting the crowns of Scotland and England for the first time. Anne of Denmark suddenly found herself queen consort, not of poor peripheral Scotland, but of wealthy, powerful England. And she thrived. In England, Anne came into her own. She established her own household at Denmark House, the former Somerset House, creating a rival court that often outshone her husband's in glamour and cultural sophistication. Anne was extravagant, spending wildly on clothes, jewels, buildings, and entertainment. Spending that constantly put her in debt and infuriated her thrifty husband, but she was also beloved by many for her generosity, her warmth, and her genuine interest in the people around her. By 1614, Anne of Denmark was 40 years old and at the height of her influence, but her body was about to betray her. September 1614, Anne was at one of her palaces, the records don't specify which, when she first complained about her feet. It started as pain, a throbbing, burning sensation in her toes and ankles that wouldn't go away. Then came swelling. Her feet puffed up, making her shoes uncomfortable, then unwearable. Walking became difficult, then painful, then nearly impossible. Her chamberlain, Viscount Lizzle, noted it in his correspondence. So did the Countess of Bedford and the Countess of Roxburghe, 2 of Anne's closest companions. They watched with growing concern as their energetic, active queen began to slow down, to struggle with movements that had once been effortless. Anne herself tried to downplay it. "Just gout," she insisted. "A common ailment among the nobility. Nothing serious. Painful, yes, but manageable. Many aristocrats suffered from it. Too much rich food, too much wine, the inevitable consequence of a life of luxury." But her physicians weren't so sure. The thing about gout is that it's rarely just gout. For wealthy Europeans in the early 17th century, what doctors called gout could be almost anything that caused joint pain and swelling. True gout, the crystallization of uric acid in the joints caused by diet and genetics, was common enough among the aristocracy. But the same symptoms could also indicate kidney disease, heart failure, arthritis, or a dozen other conditions that medicine of the era couldn't differentiate. Anne's physicians looked at her swollen feet and made their diagnosis. Gout. They prescribed the usual remedies: rest, elevation of the affected limbs, dietary modifications, herbal poultices. For a while these measures seemed to help. The swelling would go down, the pain would ease, and Anne would return to her normal activities. But it always came back. And each time it came back, it was worse. By 1615, the swelling wasn't confined to her feet anymore. Her ankles stayed puffy, even when she rested. Her legs began to retain fluid. This was edema, though they didn't call it that. They called it swelling, or noted that the queen's limbs were full of water. Anne adapted. She reduced her physical activities, spent more time seated or in bed, delegated tasks she would normally have done herself. She still presided over her court, still commissioned artworks and theatrical productions, still involved herself in political intrigues. But the woman who had once danced for hours in elaborate masks now struggled to walk across a room. Her weight increased noticeably. Whether this was cause or effect of her reduced mobility, no one could say. The rich court diet, endless courses of meat, game, fish, pastries, soaked in butter and sugar, wine with every meal, combined with her inability to exercise, created a vicious cycle. Contemporary accounts began to note, delicately, that the queen had grown corpulent. In the medical thinking of the time, this wasn't seen as a personal failing. The physicians attributed Anne's weight gain to an imbalance in her bodily humours, the four fluids that were thought to govern health and temperament. An excess of phlegm, they theorized, was making her body retain fluids and accumulate flesh. The solution, naturally, was to purge these excess humours through various means. This is where Sir Theodore de Mayerne enters the story in earnest. He was not a typical court physician, born in Geneva in 1573. He had studied medicine in Heidelberg and Montpellier, where he became fascinated with the revolutionary ideas of Paracelsus. Paracelsus had rejected the ancient humoral medicine of Galen, which had dominated medical thinking for over 1,000 years. Instead, he proposed that diseases were caused by external agents and could be treated with chemical medicines derived from minerals and metals. This iatrochemistry was controversial, even heretical to traditional physicians, but it was gaining followers among progressive doctors across Europe. When Anne's health began deteriorating in 1612, Mayerne naturally became her primary doctor as well, and he documented everything. From April 10, 1612 until Anne's death in March 1619, Mayerne kept detailed Latin case notes recording every symptom, every treatment, every success and failure. His treatments for Anne included emetics to induce vomiting, forcing her stomach to expel its contents, the theory being that this would clear corrupted humours from her system. Anne would be given preparations that made her violently nauseous, vomiting repeatedly until her stomach was empty and her throat raw, purgatives to empty her bowels, often containing mercury compounds like calomel. These powerful laxatives caused intense cramping and diarrhea, leaving Anne weak and dehydrated. The mercury itself was toxic, potentially causing side effects like excessive salivation, tremors, and kidney damage. Though doctors of the era didn't understand this, bloodletting, this left Anne anemic, exhausted, and even more vulnerable to illness. Diuretics to increase urination and reduce the fluid accumulation in her tissues. Some of these worked at least temporarily, forcing her kidneys to produce more urine and reducing the swelling, but they also depleted her body of essential salts and minerals. Here's what Mayerne couldn't understand. Why weren't his treatments working? Anne wasn't recovering. If anything, she was getting worse. Mayerne noted in his case notes that he attributed Anne's ill health to her cold and northerly upbringing, essentially blaming her Danish origins for her constitution. This was typical of medical thinking of the era, which believed that people from northern climates had fundamentally different bodily compositions than those from southern regions, making them vulnerable to certain diseases. But this explanation didn't help him cure her. What Mayerne couldn't know, what no physician of his era could know, was that Anne was almost certainly suffering from some form of organ failure, the persistent edema, the increasing difficulty breathing, which would become more prominent later, the fluid accumulation that spread from her feet to her legs to her abdomen. These are classic signs of either kidney disease, or congestive heart failure, or possibly both. In 1615, neither Mayerne nor anyone else understood any of this. They didn't know about blood pressure or kidney function or cardiac output. They couldn't measure these things, couldn't see inside the body to observe the failing organs. All they could do was treat symptoms and hope for the best. By 1617, Anne was still functional enough to go hunting in August, though whether she rode or watched from a carriage isn't clear. But by the autumn of that year, her condition had deteriorated dramatically. The letter writer John Chamberlain, who chronicled court life in detailed correspondence with friends, noted ominously, "The Queen continues still ill-disposed, and though she would fain lay all her infirmities upon the gout, yet most of her physicians fear a further inconvenience of an ill habit or disposition through her whole body." In other words, the doctors knew it wasn't just gout anymore. Something was wrong throughout her entire system. Her whole body was failing, and they had no idea how to stop it. September 1618, Oatlands Palace. Anne was in her private chambers when her nose began to bleed. At first, it seemed like nothing, a minor nosebleed, the kind anyone might experience, but this wasn't a trickle. Blood poured from her nostrils in a torrent, soaking through cloth after cloth as her attendants desperately tried to stanch the flow. Minutes passed. The bleeding didn't stop. Her ladies pressed cold compresses to her face, tilted her head back, pinched her nose, all the standard remedies. Nothing worked. The blood kept coming, running down her throat, pooling in her mouth, staining her nightgown crimson. Anne began to panic, choking on her own blood, unable to breathe properly through her nose. Then came January 1619. Hampton Court. Theodore de Mayerne made a decision that, even by the standards of 17th century medicine, seems almost insane. He instructed Anne to saw wood. Yes, you read that correctly. The Queen of England, who could barely walk, who was swollen with fluid retention, who had been bedridden for months. Mayerne wanted her to engage in physical labor, specifically, to saw logs back and forth, with a two-handled saw. His reasoning, based on his medical theory, was that vigorous physical exercise would improve Anne's blood circulation. Stagnant blood, he believed, was pooling in her extremities, causing the swelling and contributing to her overall decline. If he could get her blood moving again, through sustained physical effort, perhaps her condition would improve. It's possible to see the logic here through the lens of Renaissance medicine. Mayerne understood that exercise could be therapeutic. We know today that moderate physical activity can indeed help with circulation and fluid retention. But there's a vast difference between gentle, graduated exercise for a cardiac patient and asking someone in advanced organ failure to perform hard manual labor. Anne tried. God knows she tried. Whether from hope, desperation, or simply obedience to medical authority, she attempted to follow Mayerne's prescription. Servants brought logs and a saw to her chambers. Anne, helped to her feet by her attendants, gripped the saw handle and began to pull it back and forth. The exertion was catastrophic. Within minutes, Anne was gasping for breath, her face flushed, her heart racing. The physical effort required to saw wood, even for a short period, was far beyond what her failing body could sustain. She nearly collapsed. The experiment was immediately abandoned, and Anne's condition, instead of improving, worsened dramatically. Mayerne noted in his case files that the exercise had served to make her worse. This might be the understatement of the century. The strain on Anne's already compromised cardiovascular system likely accelerated her decline. If she had been teetering on the edge of complete organ failure before, the sawing incident may have pushed her over. In his notes, Mayerne tried to explain his patient's deterioration in the only terms he understood. Anne's cold and northerly upbringing had given her a weak constitution unsuited to the English climate and lifestyle. It was her Danish blood, her northern humours, that made her so difficult to treat. This was, of course, complete nonsense. But it allowed Mayerne to avoid confronting a more troubling possibility, that his treatments weren't just failing to help Anne, they might actually be killing her. By late January, Anne's medical team had expanded. In addition to Mayerne, she was now attended by Henry Atkins, another royal physician, and, remarkably, by a doctor named Turner, who had been recommended by Walter Raleigh before his execution. Even in death, Raleigh was still trying to help Anne, but no amount of medical attention could change what was happening. Anne's body was shutting down system by system, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Anne's brother, Christian IV of Denmark, wrote anxiously from Copenhagen. He sent letters to Mayerne, thanking him for his efforts and urging him to do everything possible to save his sister. He wrote to Lady Grey of Ruthen, one of Anne's closest companions, encouraging her to help Anne fight off the melancholy and solitude that seemed to be overtaking her. Melancholy. That curious Renaissance diagnosis that covered everything from clinical depression to what we'd now call terminal withdrawal. Christian was worried that his sister was giving up, retreating into herself, preparing for death. He wasn't wrong. Anne had begun to isolate herself. She refused most visitors, keeping only Piero Hugon and Anna Cowes close to her. Even high-ranking courtiers and ladies-in-waiting were turned away from her chamber. Only occasionally would she admit the Countess of Arundel, the Countess of Bedford, Lady Ruthin, Lady Carey, or the Countess of Derby, the women who had been her companions for years. What were they witnessing when they were allowed into that chamber? What did Anne look like in those final weeks? The sources give us glimpses, terrible glimpses. The flux, the violent diarrhea that Mayerne mentioned in his notes, continued relentlessly. Anne's bowels were in constant revolt, forcing her to soil herself repeatedly. Her attendants had to change her bedding and nightclothes constantly, trying to maintain some dignity for their dying queen, while the smell of excrement pervaded the room. The cough that had been noted earlier grew worse, more productive. Anne was bringing up thick phlegm, sometimes streaked with blood. Her breathing became laboured, each breath a struggle. This was probably fluid accumulating in her lungs, pulmonary edema, a common symptom of congestive heart failure. And the swelling continued to worsen. Anne's abdomen distended further, grotesquely swollen with accumulated fluid. Her legs were massive columns of edematous flesh. Her face became puffy and distorted, barely recognizable. She was drowning in her own fluids, slowly, inexorably, and everyone watching her knew there was nothing they could do but wait for the end. February turned to March. The winter cold persisted, and inside Anne's chamber at Hampton Court, the braziers burned day and night, filling the air with smoke and heat that made breathing even more difficult. Prince Charles visited on March 1st. He was 18 years old, shy, stammering, deeply attached to his mother, despite years of physical separation. Royal children were raised in separate households from their parents. Charles had been given his own establishment as an infant. The prince entered his mother's chamber and saw what few others were permitted to see. Whatever he witnessed there shook him profoundly. He emerged pale and shaken and left Hampton Court immediately. The next day, Anne would be dead. Anne's symptoms that final day included the relentless flux, her bowels continuing to evacuate despite having almost nothing left to expel. The cough that had been racking her body for weeks reached a crescendo, and something new appeared. Anne complained that her vision was failing. At first it was blurriness, difficulty focusing, then darkness creeping in from the edges of her sight. By the afternoon, Anna Casses, Dutch Anna, the Danish chamber who had remained faithfully at her mistress's side, realized with horror that Anne was going blind. This symptom, appearing in the final hours, might indicate several things from a modern medical perspective. Severe hypertension from kidney failure can cause retinal hemorrhages or swelling of the optic nerves, leading to sudden vision loss. Alternatively, reduced blood flow to the brain as cardiac output failed could have caused cortical blindness. Or perhaps it was simpler. Anne's body was shutting down, system by system, and her visual processing was simply failing along with everything else. Anne knew what was happening. She was dying, and dying now, and she made her final requests. She called for a glass of Rhenish wine, the crisp white wine from the Rhine Valley that she had always loved, the taste of the Germanic world she had been born into. Someone brought it to her lips. Did she drink? Could she still swallow? The sources don't say. Around her in the chamber were the women who had been permitted to attend her final hours. Dutch Anna, of course, her most constant companion, Piero Hugon, the French servant who had shared the death watch. And in the room's shadows perhaps, some of the great ladies, the Countess of Arundel, the Countess of Bedford, Lady Ruthin, Lady Carey, the Countess of Derby. Women who had served Anne for years, who had danced in her masks, attended her at hunts, shared the elaborate rituals of her court. They watched as their queen, blind now, struggled for each breath, the rattling sound in her chest, what physicians called the death rattle, fluid and mucus in the airways that the dying person can no longer cough up or swallow grew louder. And then, sometime that evening, Anne of Denmark stopped breathing. She was 44 years old. She had been queen consort for 30 years, longer than many people lived in the 17th century. She had survived the dangerous waters of Scottish politics, the transition to the English throne, multiple plots and factional conflicts, the devastating death of her beloved eldest son Henry, and she had died slowly, miserably, her body betraying her piece by piece, drowning in fluids that her failing organs could no longer process. She died in Jane Seymour's old chamber, in her own favourite bed, blind and struggling for breath, with only her most loyal servants at her side. The protocols of royal death snapped immediately into place. Anne's body was handed over to the apothecary Louis Lemire for embalming. This was an elaborate process. The internal organs were removed and placed in a separate container. The body cavity was packed with preservatives and aromatic herbs. The skin was treated with chemicals to slow decay. The goal was to preserve the corpse long enough for the elaborate funeral ceremonies that would follow. Lemire worked through the night, and by morning Anne's embalmed body was sealed in a lead coffin by Abraham Green, the sergeant plumber. Lead was used because it was impermeable. It would contain the smell of decay and prevent any fluids from leaking out during the weeks that the body would lie in state. On March 9th, 7 days after her death, Anne's lead coffin was placed on a barge and transported down the Thames to Somerset House, Denmark House, as it was now called, Anne's own palace. Here, in the rooms she had designed and decorated, her body would lie in state while funeral preparations continued. The palace was draped in black cloth. Anne's private chambers were hung with black velvet. But there was a problem: money. King James, despite ruling 3 kingdoms, was perpetually broke. Years of extravagant spending, generous gifts to favourites, and poor financial management had left the crown deeply in debt, and royal funerals were astronomically expensive. The main expense was black cloth. Mourning garments were required for everyone attending the funeral, with the amount and quality of black fabric determined by rank. Days became weeks, weeks became months. Meanwhile, Anne's body lay in its lead coffin at Denmark House, while the court waited. For over 2 months, Anne's corpse remained at Denmark House, and members of the court took turns sitting vigil beside the coffin. This was considered an honour, to watch over the dead queen's body, to pray for her soul, to demonstrate one's loyalty and grief. The funeral procession began at Denmark House and would make its way through the streets of London to Westminster Abbey. By the time it assembled, it included over 2,000 people, all dressed in black mourning clothes. The procession moved slowly through London's streets. Very slowly. The sheer weight of the mourning garments, 12 to 16 yards of heavy cloth wrapped around each woman, made walking difficult. After the public ceremony ended, the actual burial took place privately that evening. Sir Edward Zouch, the Knight Marshal, supervised as Anne's lead coffin was lowered into the vault beneath the abbey floor. She was placed in the Henry VII Chapel, in a vault that would later house other royal bodies, though Anne herself would never receive the permanent tomb monument she might have expected. Anne of Denmark's death removed a significant political force from the English court. Her independent household at Denmark House had functioned as a rival power centre to King James's court, a place where nobles could seek patronage, where women could exercise political influence, where cultural innovation flourished, and culturally, Anne's patronage of the arts had set standards that would influence English court life for decades. The elaborate masks she had pioneered, combining drama, music, dance, and spectacular visual effects, would continue to be produced, though never quite with the same innovative energy Anne had brought to them. She died badly, painfully, messily, her dignity stripped away by the failures of her own body. But she lived boldly, and that's what we should remember. Anne of Denmark died on March 2, 1619, at Hampton Court Palace, her body swollen with dropsy, blind and struggling for breath, attended by her most faithful servants. But before that, she had lived, and what a life it was.